The message arrived at 7:11 on a Thursday night in late October. I had just poured a glass of wine after finalizing a deal that would shift 300 jobs across the Midwest. My phone buzzed against the cold stone counter, and I lifted it expecting a note from my business partner. Instead, my father's name lit the screen. "Don't try coming to the family gala. We're cutting ties. You don't belong there anyway." I reread the text, waiting for some sign it was a mistake, an unfinished draft, a misdirected message, anything. Nothing changed. A second notification appeared before the shock had time to settle. "Everyone else makes us proud. You only bring us shame." My mother. A third followed, sharp and dismissive. "You don't fit in. Stay home. Derek." I placed the phone on the counter with careful precision, the way one handles something cracked, but still intact. The wine remained untouched. Beyond the window, Minneapolis glittered in indifferent silence, a city refusing to acknowledge the small implosion unfolding inside one of its high-rise apartments. 29 years of trying to belong, 29 years spent shaping myself into someone they might eventually recognize, and in 3 text messages, I vanished from my own family. My response came slowly, each letter deliberate. Understood. No pleadings, no questions, no emotion they could use to insist I was overreacting again. The single word felt like closing a door with my fingertips. The family gala had once been simple, a Thanksgiving gathering with extended relatives. Derek turned it into something else entirely, an annual stage for investors and clients, a place where the Marlowe family performed success with rehearsed smiles and curated anecdotes. It had become their pride, their proof, their chosen narrative, and I had just been written out of it. Humiliation should have broken me. 10 years earlier it would have, but distance and work had hardened something quiet inside me, something I didn't know I was building until they tried to take it away. Still, the rejection ached, not because I needed their party, but because it confirmed what had always lived beneath the surface. I had never belonged in the story they told about themselves. The instinct to reach for the phone returned in a sharp wave. Part of me imagined confronting my mother, demanding she explain why her daughter, successful, stable, self-sufficient, had become the family's source of shame. Another part pictured pressing Derek for an honest reason rather than the usual deflection. Neither impulse made it past the level of imagination. Experience had already taught me how those conversations ended. Accusations twisted into misunderstandings. Pain diluted into "you're too sensitive." Every attempt turned into proof that I was difficult. I refused to hand them another scene to rewrite. The night folded around me quietly. I went to bed early and unexpectedly slept well. There's a strange relief that comes from no longer pretending a door is open when it has always been locked. Morning arrived with a different kind of noise, 17 missed calls. A voicemail from my father. Several attempts from Derek. 2 from my mother. I watched the icons blink on the screen, then slid the notifications away one by one. Whatever explanations they had cobbled together in the dark didn't deserve space in my morning. My work filled the hours that followed. It always did. Supply chain analytics didn't charm most people, but the logic of movement and pattern had been a refuge for me long before it became a career. Systems didn't play favorites. Data didn't ignore you. Algorithms didn't ask you to shrink so someone else could shine. 2 years earlier, I had sold my startup to a logistics conglomerate for $40 million. That sale had funded Windermere the $30 million lake house the press wrote about for weeks. I bought it not as a trophy but as a boundary, a place untouched by the hierarchy that had shaped every corner of my childhood. My family dismissed the achievement with the same word they used for everything I built: luck. Derek said it first. My mother changed the subject. My father said nothing. Silence from him always carried more weight than criticism. Standing in my kitchen now with coffee cooling between my hands, I understood the subtext of those messages more clearly than I had the night before. The gala wasn't about family. It was about optics, about the image they curated, where Derek flourished and the rest of us arranged ourselves to support his shine. My presence didn't enhance the picture they feared, it distorted it. But there was something else in the timing, something that didn't align. The gala was still weeks away. They didn't need to exile me so abruptly unless something behind the scenes was unraveling. The thought lingered long after I set the mug down. I worked through the following days the way one navigates a storm, attention's sharp emotions tethered. But at night, the texts replayed themselves, the cruelty in their phrasing too deliberate to ignore. The timing still bothered me. Something had shifted inside their world and they were closing ranks. When the truth finally surfaced, it carried the weight of every suspicion I'd buried. And it began ironically with paperwork addressed to me, paperwork for a debt I had never agreed to take on. I didn't cry over their messages. I want to be clear about that. The version of me who would have asked what I'd done wrong no longer existed. Distance had taught me a truth I wish I'd learned earlier. Some families love the idea of you, not the reality, and some only love you when you're useful. I archived their messages in a folder titled Family. Then I moved forward because grief over people who never saw you is a luxury that only delays the life you were meant to build. Their next move came soon after, and unlike their texts, it wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. If you want to understand the decisions I made later, you have to understand the quiet architecture of my childhood, the way loyalty was expected, how affection was rationed, and how a single child became the axis we all revolved around. That orbit belonged to Derek long before I learned what favoritism even meant. He arrived 4 years ahead of me, and by the time I took my first breath, the family had already crowned him their future. My father coached his teams. My mother chronicled every certificate, every compliment, every minor achievement with the devotion of someone archiving history. Photographs of Derek filled the house arranged with the care of museum pieces. I fit into the margins of that curated world present but uncelebrated. They were not unkind in the practical sense. There was food on the table rides when schedules allowed reminders about homework. But care and attention are not the same currency. I received the former. Derek received the latter. And attention shapes a person more deeply than meals ever could. The inequity wasn't loud. It was woven into the background like wallpaper, constant, unexamined, and eventually invisible. Derek's mistakes were met with sympathy solutions and investment. Mine were dismissed as lessons I should have known better than to need. When he wrecked the family car at 17, he got a newer one before the month ended. When I asked for help buying textbooks, I got advice about responsibility. So I learned responsibility. I woke before dawn to wait tables, worked weekends at the library, and read to elderly patients in the evenings. By 17, I could afford my own battered Honda paid for in quiet increments. No one commented on it. Meanwhile, Derek cruised through town in a glossy Mustang, the keys handed to him with pride. It didn't take long to understand the unspoken script. Derek was destined for greatness, and greatness apparently required a stage built by the rest of us. I was instructed through size, omissions, and subtle corrections to stay in the wings. The pattern hardened further when Sabrina entered the picture. My parents adored her immediately. She carried herself with an ease that impressed them, and they projected every hope they'd ever pinned on Derek straight onto her. My mother once described her as the daughter I always wanted. She didn't whisper it. She didn't check if I was in the room. She simply said it, and Sabrina smiled as though accepting an award. Their wedding confirmed what I had already sensed: I was useful, not valued. My role was administrative envelopes, florists, spreadsheets, not emotional. In photos, I stood at the edges, cropped out when the frame tightened around the people who truly mattered to them. After the wedding, the gravitational pull around Derek intensified. Holidays relocated to his house. Stories revolved around his life, his children, his ambitions. I received invitations only after final head counts were set, as if space for me existed only when someone else canceled. Conversations dissolved whenever I approached. I became the person you greet politely but do not include. Still, I tried to address it once. I thought clarity might open a path to change. Instead, I was told I was dramatic, difficult, and ungrateful. Derek even looked genuinely puzzled when I tried to explain. "We treat you exactly the same," he said. "Maybe you just need more." That sentence landed with such quiet finality that I stopped trying altogether. When the distance grew, I filled it with effort. I chased scholarships, chased knowledge, chased any opportunity that wasn't handed to Derek by default. My parents didn't attend my college graduation, though I waited for them in the crowd out of habit. They never apologized. They simply never mentioned it, as if my achievements existed in a different language. We grew apart because growth was the only direction left for me. What they never realized was that all their neglect had a secondary effect. While they built a pedestal for Derek, I built competence. While they poured their hopes into him, I built a life without their help. And by the time I reached 29, I had quietly surpassed every expectation they had ever assigned to me. The lake house on Windermere wasn't just a purchase. It was a testament to the fact that I could succeed without being chosen, without being celebrated, without belonging to the family narrative they had constructed. For years, I believed I needed their approval to feel legitimate. But adulthood teaches you things. Childhood hides. Some people cannot give you what you need, even if they love you in the only way they know how. And sometimes what they call love is really control wrapped in tradition. I used to think I was the broken one. Now I know the truth. They simply never looked closely enough to see who I really was. I didn't realize how far I'd traveled from the girl they once underestimated until the day my first algorithm rewrote the balance sheet of a major trucking company. I was 24, sitting in a cubicle, no one visited, sorting through delivery routes that stretched across 6 states. The data looked chaotic at first glance, but certain inefficiencies flickered like beacons once I studied them long enough. Entire routes zigzagged for no reason. Fuel costs ballooned where they shouldn't have. Time bled out of the schedule in predictable patterns no one else had noticed. I built a model late at night long after most analysts had gone home. The software wasn't elegant, but the logic behind it was precise. When I presented the projection to my supervisor, he skimmed the summary and dismissed the idea as overly ambitious. I insisted on a small trial, 6 trucks, 3 months. He signed off only because the pilot cost nothing. The results forced him to take credit publicly and give me quiet praise privately. Operating expenses plummeted, and the company saved millions before the year ended. That experience reshaped my understanding of power. Insight had weight, but only if I controlled its direction. I left the firm at 26. Consulting offered independence, though it demanded everything I had. Weeks blurred into spreadsheets, warehouse audits, and negotiations with executives who underestimated me until the numbers spoke for themselves. Each success widened the distance between who my family believed I was and who I was becoming. A pharmaceutical distributor in Ohio nearly collapsed under the weight of its own outdated systems. Their CEO, Margaret Chen, reached out after hearing about my earlier work. She didn't sugarcoat the problem. Inventory losses were threatening bankruptcy. I spent 3 weeks embedded in their operation. Forklifts beeped nonstop. Dust-coated forgotten boxes. Entire product lines sat untouched in corners while high-demand items ran out weekly. Patterns emerged again. Their forecasting model lived in the past. I designed something different, responsive, adaptive, capable of reading economic indicators and health data simultaneously. Within months, the company regained stability. Within a year, they expanded. Margaret credited me publicly, and doors that had previously been locked swung open. At 28, I hired a team. The warehouse I converted into an office smelled faintly of dry timber and old machinery. Whiteboards covered every wall, each surface, crowded with equations, timelines, and supply chain diagrams. The energy in that space felt electric. We named the company Clarity Systems because the work cut through noise. Clients sought us out to make sense of chaos. The acquisition offer arrived unexpectedly. A Chicago conglomerate wanted everything: the team, the technology, my vision. Negotiations took months, and every clause was a battle. When the contract was finally signed, $40 million appeared in my account. Silence followed. The achievement was real, but it didn't feel glamorous. It felt earned, a decade of grit distilled into one moment. That was the day I realized I had surpassed every limitation my family once placed on me. Windermere came next. 30 acres of untouched shoreline, a structure designed around glass cedar and stillness. I walked through the house before buying it and felt something settle inside me. Not triumph clarity. This was the version of my life I had built out of refusal. Out of all the nights I worked, while Derek slept all the hours I spent climbing without a safety net. News of the purchase spread quickly. Derek called first, framing my success as luck again. That single word had become their shorthand for anything I accomplished. My mother avoided this topic entirely, as though ignoring my achievements preserved a hierarchy she wasn't ready to release. My father simply changed the subject every time I appeared in conversation. Their reactions no longer surprised me, but they revealed something deeper. They needed me to remain small. If I grew beyond the boundaries they assigned, the stories they told themselves wouldn't hold. Windermere became my refuge. Weekends passed without interruption. Mornings started with quiet walks along the shoreline. Evenings ended with the water turning the color of steel under a fading sky. That house reminded me daily that I had broken free of a narrative they once controlled. But peace rarely lasts untouched. One Tuesday morning, an envelope from my accountant appeared in the mail, ordinary at first glance, until I noticed the company name inside Marlowe Construction Partners, a firm I had never heard of, a balance I had never authorized, an obligation worth nearly $2 million. The page in my hands felt heavier with every line I read. Someone had used my name. Someone had leveraged my identity. Someone had signed me to a debt that didn't belong to me. That single invoice cracked open the truth. And once the crack appeared, everything behind it began to fall. 3 weeks before the text messages arrived, I had decided to attend the family gala anyway. I know that sounds contradictory given everything I've told you about my distance from them, but there was a part of me, small but persistent, that still hoped for reconciliation. I had achieved more than they ever expected. Perhaps I thought they might finally see me differently. The gala was scheduled for the first Saturday of November, held at the Rochester Country Club, as it had been for the past several years. I received my invitation in September, a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering. The date inside was wrong. It listed the event as occurring on Sunday instead of Saturday. I assumed it was a printing error and marked my calendar for the correct day. I should have known better. I drove to Rochester on that Saturday afternoon, wearing a dress I had purchased specifically for the occasion. Navy blue silk, elegant but not ostentatious. I wanted to show them that success hadn't changed who I was fundamentally. I still valued family. I still wanted to belong. The country club parking lot was already full when I arrived. Staff moved between the cars, directing traffic with practiced efficiency. I handed over my keys and walked toward the entrance, my heels clicking against the flagstone path. The first sign of trouble came at the door. A young man in a suit consulted his tablet and frowned. "I don't see your name on the list," he said. "Could you spell it for me?" I spelled it twice. He scrolled through his screen, his frown deepening. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're not here. Are you sure you received an invitation?" I showed him the invitation on my phone, the photographed image I had saved. He looked at it, then looked at me with genuine sympathy. "That's for tomorrow," he said. "Sunday. Tonight's event is invitation only." I felt the first cold wave of understanding wash over me. The wrong date hadn't been a printing error. It had been deliberate. They had sent me the wrong information, intentionally ensuring I would arrive when the party was already underway, ensuring I would be turned away at the door. I stood there for a moment processing. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows beside the entrance, I could see the ballroom. Light fixtures cast warm light over dozens of round tables draped in white linen. Waiters moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. At the far end of the room, a small stage had been set up with a podium and microphone. My brother Derek stood at that podium. I could see him clearly through the glass, his suit perfectly tailored, his smile confident and broad. Behind him, a projection screen displayed the logo of Marlowe Construction Partners, the same company name I had seen on that mysterious invoice. My father sat at the nearest table to the stage, my mother beside him. They were both watching Derek with expressions of pure pride, the kind of pride I had spent my entire life trying to earn. Sabrina sat on my father's other side, laughing at something someone had said. Her dress was emerald green, expensive-looking. Her jewelry caught the light. I watched them through the window like a ghost observing the living. They looked so happy, so complete, a family portrait from which I had been carefully excised. Then I saw Sabrina lean toward one of the other guests, a woman in a red dress I didn't recognize. Sabrina's lips moved, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could read her expression. Dismissive, amused. She glanced toward the entrance where I stood, and for a moment our eyes met through the glass. She didn't wave. She didn't acknowledge me. She simply turned back to her conversation as if I were no more significant than a passing shadow. The young man at the door was still watching me with concern. "Is there someone inside I could contact for you?" he asked. I shook my head. "No," I said. "There's no one." I walked back to the valet stand and retrieved my car. The drive home took 3 hours, and I spent every minute of it replaying what I had seen. The wrong invitation date, the security that turned me away, the look on Sabrina's face when she saw me standing outside. They had planned this. Every detail had been orchestrated to ensure my humiliation. They wanted me to show up, wanted me to be turned away, wanted me to know exactly how little I mattered to them. The text messages came 3 weeks later, but the decision had been made long before. I was not wanted. I never had been. That night, standing in my kitchen with those cruel messages glowing on my phone screen, I finally understood something I had been refusing to accept for years. My family was not indifferent to me. Indifference would have been easier. What they felt was something closer to contempt, an active desire to exclude me, to remind me of my place. But why now? Why had they chosen this moment to formalize my exile? The timing nagged at me. The mysterious invoice, the wrong invitation date, the sudden urgency of their rejection. Something was happening in my family that I didn't understand. And whatever it was, they were working very hard to keep me from discovering it. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down at my computer. If they wanted to cut me out, fine. But I was not going to fade quietly into the background. I was going to find out what they were hiding. And when I did, they would learn that the daughter they had dismissed as worthless was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The search began that night. It would take me weeks to uncover the full truth, but when I did, it would change everything. The invoice led me to my lawyer, and my lawyer led me to a forensic accountant named Patricia Okonkwo. Patricia was a small woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for uncovering financial fraud that larger firms had missed. She worked out of a cluttered office in downtown Minneapolis, surrounded by filing cabinets stuffed with documents from 100 different investigations. I showed her the invoice. I explained about the mysterious company Marlowe Construction Partners. I told her about my family's sudden decision to cut me out. And I asked her the question that had been burning in my mind since that night outside the gala. What are they hiding? Patricia studied the invoice for a long moment. Then she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Have you ever co-signed a loan for your brother?" she asked. "Or guaranteed any of his debts?" "Never," I said. "I haven't spoken to him about money in years." She nodded slowly. "Let me look into this. I'll need a few days." Those few days stretched into 2 weeks. During that time, I tried to continue with my normal life. I met with clients. I reviewed contracts. I spent a weekend at the lake house trying to find the peace that usually came so easily there. But my mind kept returning to Patricia's question. Co-signed a loan. Guaranteed his debts. When she finally called, her voice was carefully controlled. The way a doctor sounds when delivering bad news they've seen too many times before. "You need to come to my office," she said. I found something. I arrived within the hour. Patricia had spread documents across her desk, a paper trail that stretched back nearly 2 years. Bank statements, loan applications, corporate filings, and in the center of it all, a document that made my blood run cold. It was a personal guarantee form for a business loan of $5 million. The borrower was listed as Marlowe Construction Partners, LLC. The guarantor was me. My name, my social security number. My supposed signature at the bottom of the page. "I've never seen this document before," I said. My voice sounded distant, disconnected from my body. Patricia nodded. "I didn't think you had. The signature is a forgery, a decent one but not perfect. I had a handwriting analyst take a look. He's confident it wasn't written by you." The room seemed to tilt around me. Someone had forged my signature on a loan guarantee. Someone had used my financial reputation to secure millions of dollars in funding, and based on the name of the company, that someone was almost certainly my brother. "There's more," Patricia said. She slid another document toward me. "This is the company's current financial statement. Marlowe Construction Partners has been operating at a loss for 18 months. They've missed several loan payments. The bank has been sending warning letters for the past 6 months. Warning letters," I repeated. "To whom?" "To the address on file, your brother's office." She paused. "But also to you. At least to the address they have listed for the guarantor." I stared at her. "I never received any letters." "No," Patricia said. "You wouldn't have. The address they used is a P.O. box registered to your mother." The full picture was starting to form in my mind, ugly and undeniable. My family had used my identity to secure a loan for Derek's failing business. They had funneled the warning letters to a mailbox I would never check. And when the business started to collapse, they had cut me out of the family entirely, ensuring I would have no reason to investigate what they had done. The timing of those text messages suddenly made terrible sense. They hadn't rejected me because they were ashamed of me. They had rejected me because they were afraid of what I might discover. "What happens now?" I asked. "If the company defaults on this loan, am I responsible?" Patricia shook her head. "Not if we can prove the signature was forged, but we'll need to act quickly. The bank is already preparing to call in the loan. If they come after you before we establish that you're not the legitimate guarantor, it could get messy." Messy. Such a mild word for what my family had done. They had committed financial fraud. They had stolen my identity. They had used me as an invisible safety net, gambling my reputation and creditworthiness on a business venture I knew nothing about. And they had done it without a moment's hesitation, because to them I wasn't a person with my own life and own interests. I was a resource to be exploited, a backup plan, a name on a form. I want to see everything I said, every document, every email, every communication related to this loan. Patricia nodded. "It will take time to compile, but I can have a preliminary package ready for you by the end of the week." That week was one of the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my daily routine, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about my parents, about Derek, about Sabrina. I kept wondering how long they had been planning this. Had they targeted me from the beginning, identifying me as the family member most likely to have assets worth borrowing against? Or had it happened more gradually, a slow-motion betrayal that escalated as Derek's business spiraled toward failure? The document package arrived on Friday. I spread it across my dining room table and began to read. The story it told was damning. Derek had approached the bank 2 years earlier seeking funding to expand his construction supply business. His own credit was mediocre at best, weighed down by previous debts and a string of failed ventures. But the bank had agreed to make the loan if he could provide a personal guarantor with stronger financials. That's where I came in. Or rather, that's where my identity came in. Someone, presumably Derek, with help from my parents, had assembled a package of my financial information. Tax returns, bank statements, credit reports, documents that could only have been obtained through deliberate deception or outright theft. The forged signature appeared on multiple documents, not just the loan guarantee, but also authorization forms, disclosure agreements, and correspondence with the bank. Whoever had created these forgeries had been thorough. They had studied my handwriting. They had mimicked my email style. They had constructed an entire false version of me, a version willing to stake her financial future on her brother's failing business. I found emails between Derek and my father discussing the plan in clinical terms. She'll never know my father had written, and even if she finds out, what's she going to do? Go to the police against her own family? My mother's contribution was more subtle but equally damning. In one email to Derek, she had written, "Alexia always wanted to help the family. This is just another way for her to contribute. She should be grateful we're including her at all." Grateful! The word made me want to scream. They had stolen my identity, forged my signature, and put my financial future at risk, and my mother thought I should be grateful for the opportunity. The final document in the package was the most recent bank communication. It informed Marlowe Construction Partners that they were in default on their loan payments. The bank was initiating recovery proceedings, and as the listed guarantor, I would be contacted shortly to discuss repayment options. I sat at my dining room table until well past midnight, reading and rereading those documents. The betrayal was complete, total, absolute. My family had not just excluded me from their lives. They had tried to use me as a financial sacrifice, a scapegoat for their own failures. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated what I was capable of when pushed too far. The morning after I read those documents, I made 2 phone calls. The first was Patricia Okonkwo. The second was to a corporate attorney named Marcus Webb, a partner at one of the most respected firms in Minneapolis. I had worked with Marcus before during the sale of Clarity Systems. I trusted his judgment and his discretion. We met at Marcus's office that afternoon. Patricia joined us, bringing her complete file on the forgery investigation. For 2 hours, we reviewed the evidence together, building a case that would prove my innocence and expose my family's fraud. "The signature is clearly forged," Patricia said. "My expert is willing to testify to that in court if necessary. And the paper trail shows a clear pattern of deception. They obtained your financial information without authorization, used it to secure a loan you knew nothing about, and then intercepted all communications to prevent you from discovering what they had done." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "What do you want to do with this information?" he asked me. "We have several options. We could go to the police and file charges for identity theft and fraud. We could contact the bank directly and present our evidence, or we could approach your family privately and demand they resolve this themselves." I had thought about this question all night. The answer had come to me sometime around 3 a.m, when the city was silent, and my anger had finally cooled into something harder and more precise. "I want to withdraw from the loan," I said, formally and officially. "I want the bank to know that I never authorized this guarantee and that I'm not responsible for any debts incurred by Marlowe Construction Partners." Marcus exchanged a glance with Patricia. "That's certainly possible," he said. "But you should understand the consequences. Once we notify the bank that the guarantee was forged, they'll launch their own investigation. Your brother's company will almost certainly have its accounts frozen while that investigation proceeds. If the company is already in default, this could accelerate its collapse." I understood what he was saying. By protecting myself, I would be pulling the financial rug out from under my family. Derek's company would likely fail. My parents, who had invested their own savings in his venture, might lose everything. The comfortable life they had built around Derek's supposed success would come crashing down. "Do it," I said. Marcus nodded. He didn't ask if I was sure. He could see in my eyes that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. The paperwork took 3 days to prepare. During that time, I made copies of every document in the file, storing them in multiple secure locations. I called this collection my Redemption Archive, a record of everything my family had done and everything I was doing in response. If they tried to deny their actions later, I would have proof. On the 4th day, Marcus submitted our formal notification to the bank. The letter was precise and devastating. It explained that I had never authorized any guarantee on behalf of Marlowe Construction Partners. It included the handwriting analysis proving my signature had been forged, and it demanded that my name be removed from all loan documents immediately. The bank's response was swift. Within 48 hours, they had frozen Derek's company accounts pending a full investigation. Marcus received a call from the bank's legal department confirming that they were taking our allegations seriously. They would not pursue me for any debts owed by Marlowe Construction Partners. I was safe. My finances were protected. My reputation would remain intact. But the dominoes were just beginning to fall. The first call came from Derek on a Wednesday evening. I watched his name flash on my phone screen but didn't answer. The voicemail he left was equal parts confusion and accusation. "What did you do?" he demanded. "The bank froze our accounts. They're saying something about fraud. Call me back. Now." I didn't call back. The second call came from my father an hour later. His voice was tighter, more controlled. "Alexia," he said, "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but this is a family matter. We need to discuss this privately. Call me." I didn't call back. The third call came from my mother. She didn't leave a voicemail. Instead, she sent a text message. One word: ungrateful. I saved that message. I saved all of them for the Redemption Archive. Over the next several days, the calls multiplied. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from numbers I recognized and numbers I didn't. Derek called 11 times. My father called 8. My mother called twice more, then gave up. Even Sabrina called once, her message dripping with performative concern. "We're all very worried about you," she said. "This behavior isn't like you. Please reach out when you're ready to be reasonable." I wasn't ready to be reasonable. I wasn't sure I ever would be again. The most revealing call came from Derek's accountant, a man named Stephen Hargrove. I had met him once years earlier at a family dinner. He had seemed competent and unobtrusive, the kind of professional who stayed in the background and kept the numbers in order. His voicemail was frantic. "Ms. Marlowe," he said, "I don't know exactly what happened, but the company is in serious trouble. We're looking at default within 60 days if we can't restore access to our accounts. I understand there may have been some misunderstandings about the loan documentation. I'm hoping we can clear this up quickly. Please call me at your earliest convenience." Misunderstandings. What a careful word for forgery and fraud. I didn't call Stephen back either, but I did forward his message to Marcus, adding it to the growing file of evidence. Every panicked voicemail, every accusatory text, every desperate plea confirmed what the documents had already proven. My family had built their house of cards on my stolen identity, and now that house was collapsing. I spent that weekend at the lake house watching autumn settle over the water. The trees had turned gold and crimson, their reflections shimmering on the surface of the lake. I sat on my dock for hours thinking about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the forgery, the systematic exploitation that my family had practiced for years without my knowledge. I should have felt victorious. I had protected myself. I had exposed their fraud. I had turned their scheme against them. But victory wasn't what I felt. What I felt was something closer to grief. The loss of something I had always known wasn't real, but had hoped might become real someday. The final death of the family I had wished for, but never actually had. The water lapped gently against the dock. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispered secrets, and somewhere in Rochester my family was watching their carefully constructed world fall apart. I didn't feel sorry for them, but I didn't feel happy either. I felt free. The full scope of the crisis became clear on a Monday morning, 1 week after Marcus submitted our notification to the bank. I woke to 78 missed calls on my phone. 43 were from Derek, 22 were from my father, 8 were from my mother. 5 were from numbers I didn't recognize, which I later learned belonged to various attorneys and accountants connected to the family business. There were also 11 voicemails. I listened to each one, taking notes as the story unfolded. The bank had completed its preliminary investigation. They had confirmed that my signature on the guarantee documents was indeed forged. This meant that the loan was now unsecured, lacking the financial backing they had been counting on. The bank was demanding immediate repayment of the outstanding balance. If Marlowe Construction Partners couldn't pay, they would pursue legal action against Derek personally. The amount due was $4.3 million. My father's voicemail was the most telling. His voice cracked as he spoke, stripped of its usual authority. "Alexia," he said, "I know we've had our differences. I know things haven't always been fair. But this is your family. Your brother could lose everything. Your mother and I could lose our home. Please, just call us back. We can work this out." Derek's voicemails evolved over the course of the night, shifting from angry accusations of sabotage to desperate pleas for understanding. The final message, left at 4:17 in the morning, was barely coherent. "You have to fix this," he mumbled. "I don't understand why you're doing this. We're family. Family." The word had never sounded more hollow. I chose not to return any of the calls. Instead, I went to work. I had a client meeting that morning, a routine review of logistics optimization for a retail chain based in Wisconsin. The work was straightforward, the kind of analysis I could do almost automatically, but it grounded me. It reminded me that I had built a life outside of their chaos, a life that would continue regardless of what happened to them. That afternoon, I received a different kind of message, an email from an address I didn't recognize with a subject line that made my heart skip. "From your Aunt Eleanor, regarding the family situation." Eleanor was my mother's younger sister. She had married a dentist in Duluth and moved there 30 years ago, maintaining only minimal contact with the rest of the family. I had always liked her during our rare interactions. She seemed more genuine than the others, less invested in the status competitions that defined Marlowe family gatherings. Her email was brief but significant. "Dear Alexia," she wrote, "I've heard some troubling things about what's happening with Derek's business. I've also heard some troubling things about how your name got involved. I think there's information you should have. Can we meet?" I replied within the hour, suggesting a coffee shop midway between Minneapolis and Duluth. She agreed to meet me the following Saturday. The days between felt interminable. My phone vibrated constantly with notifications. New voicemails accumulated, but I let them all roll to archive. My father sent a series of increasingly desperate texts. "Your mother is having chest pains from the stress. If something happens to her, it will be on your conscience." I recognized the manipulation for what it was. My mother had always weaponized her health during family conflicts. I remained firm in my decision to avoid contact. Saturday arrived cold and clear. I drove north through rolling farmland, watching the landscape gradually shift from agricultural plains to dense pine forests. The coffee shop Eleanor had chosen was a small place on the outskirts of a town I had never heard of. Eleanor was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth near the back with a manila folder in front of her. She stood to hug me, and I was surprised by how tightly she held on. She had aged since I last saw her, her hair silver now instead of the auburn I remembered. But her eyes were still sharp, still kind. "Thank you for coming," she said as we sat down. "I know this must be confusing." I gestured at the folder. "What is that?" She sighed. "Things I probably should have shown you years ago, but I didn't want to get involved. I told myself it wasn't my place." She paused. I was wrong. She opened the folder and began to spread documents across the table. Emails she had printed, text messages she had screenshotted, notes from conversations she had overheard at family gatherings. "I've always stayed on the periphery," she explained. "Your mother and I were never close, and after I moved to Duluth, I mostly heard about family events secondhand. But people forget I'm there sometimes. They talk like I'm part of the furniture. And I remember things." She pointed to one of the printed emails. "This is from 2 years ago. Your mother sent it to Derek," read the second paragraph. I read. The words blurred together at first, then sharpened into terrible clarity. Alexia doesn't need to know my mother had written. She's always been distant anyway. And frankly, she owes this family. We raised her, fed her, and gave her opportunities. The least she can do is help Derek when he needs it. She won't even notice the guarantee. By the time she finds out the business will be profitable and we can pay off the loan. No harm done. No harm done. As if stealing my identity was a minor inconvenience. As if betraying my trust was a reasonable price to pay for their ambitions. "There's more," Eleanor said. She showed me text messages between my father and Derek discussing how to obtain my financial records. She showed me notes from a phone conversation where my mother had coached Derek on how to forge my signature. She showed me a draft of the guarantee document with practice versions of my name scrawled in the margins. They had been so thorough, so deliberate. This wasn't a moment of desperation or a single bad decision. This was a coordinated campaign of fraud planned and executed over months. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment. "Because you deserve to know the truth," she said. "And because I'm tired of watching them use you. You've always been treated like you don't matter, like you're just a resource to be exploited. It was wrong when you were a child, and it's wrong now." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I know you've already taken steps to protect yourself. I think that was the right thing to do. But I wanted you to understand the full scope of what they did. You're not imagining things. You never were. They really did see you as less valuable than Derek. They really did plan to sacrifice you for his benefit. And they would have kept doing it forever if you hadn't stopped them." I looked down at the documents spread across the table. Evidence of a betrayal that stretched back years, decades even. The systematic devaluation of my worth documented in my family's own words. I didn't cry. I had moved beyond tears. What I felt instead was a cold, clear certainty. I had been right to protect myself. I had been right to expose their fraud, and I would be right to refuse whatever came next. Eleanor added the documents to my collection, my redemption archive growing fuller by the hour. The message from Emma reached me just as the fog lifted off the lake. The morning carried a quiet weight, the kind that usually settled into the glass walls of Windermere before dispersing. But her name appeared on my screen with a suddenness that shifted the entire day. Emma Marlowe, the child who never learned to treat me like a footnote. I opened the email with more caution than I wanted to admit. "I don't know what's happening with my parents," she wrote. "No one will tell me anything. But if you're not mad at me, could you show me how computers work? I want to learn, and you're the only person I know who knows these things. A small thing, a simple question." Yet it landed deeper than any apology my parents had ever offered. I reread her words while standing barefoot on the deck. Wind brushed across the lake, stirring faint ripples into motion. For weeks, I had been bracing myself against every update from attorneys, accountants, investigators, each message an echo of the betrayal I was still cataloging. Emma's note felt like something from a different world entirely. I answered before doubt had the chance to gather. "I'd be glad to teach you, and you can always write to me no matter what happens between the adults." Sending that message steadied me more than the morning air. It reminded me that endings inside a family didn't have to apply equally to every generation. Some connections could still be built honestly without debt, and without pretending that history had never happened. Only then did I let my attention settle back onto the lake house. Windermere had become more than a sanctuary. It was the first place that reflected my life rather than the version my family insisted I inhabit. 30 acres of shoreline wrapped around the house like a quiet vow I had made to myself. No more shrinking, no more angling for approval, no more bending into someone else's comfort. The living room still held maps and early sketches I had drawn for the program I was shaping, Clarity Path, the pipeline for women stepping into logistics and tech. I had envisioned small workshops at first, maybe a mentorship circle, but the interest had expanded far quicker than expected. Messages from university coordinators and nonprofit directors filled my inbox daily. They wanted to partner, wanted to fund, wanted to scale. I resisted the urge to rush. Building something that mattered required patience, and patience was a skill I had mastered one lonely year at a time. When I stepped outside again, the lake was turning brighter under a widening sky. This land had been mocked by my family as extravagant, unnecessary a showpiece I bought only to flaunt success. They never understood that Windermere wasn't a symbol, it was a boundary, a physical and emotional perimeter that no one could cross without invitation. I had earned that perimeter by refusing to let their limitations shape my future. The first call with Emma happened that evening. She appeared on my screen with a shy, unsure smile, as though afraid her parents' decisions had somehow disqualified her from speaking to me. "I hope this isn't weird," she said. "It isn't," I replied. "You're learning something new. That's never weird." Her relief was immediate. We talked about beginner coding exercises. I showed her how simple logic worked. She asked a dozen questions, each one sharper than the last. 10 minutes turned into an hour. When we ended the call, she waved with a kind of sincerity I hadn't seen from a Marlowe in a long time. After closing my laptop, I sat on the floor beside the panoramic windows. The lake reflected the steady drift of clouds, every shape mirrored with precision. When I inhaled, something unknotted in my chest, something that had been tight since the night of the forged loan guarantee. It struck me then gently but unmistakably that healing didn't always come from justice or confrontation. Sometimes it arrived through small, untrained hands reaching forward without pretense. Emma didn't want anything from me except knowledge. No manipulation, no expectation, no entitlement. She asked for guidance the way a child is supposed to, without assuming the world owes her answers. Over the next week, our calls became routine. She sent screenshots of tiny programs she wrote after school. I corrected her errors, praised the clean lines she managed on her own, and watched her curiosity take shape. Each message felt like proof that cycles didn't have to repeat if someone bothered to step outside them. Meanwhile, the silence from my parents deepened. They didn't reach out. They didn't ask about the bank. They didn't attempt apologies or strategies or emotional ambushes. Their absence was complete, And surprisingly, it didn't sting. It simply clarified what I already knew. Some relationships collapse because they were hollow from the start. Windermere soaked up the quiet. Days passed without interruption. I walked the trails behind the house during late afternoons, letting the crunch of leaves underfoot remind me that change was natural, inevitable, and often overdue. Nights were spent drafting materials for Clarity Path modules about forecasting systems, architecture, freight optimization. Work that had nothing to do with my family and everything to do with the women who would follow after me. On the Friday before my next meeting with Marcus, I returned to the dock with a cup of tea. The water had darkened under an early evening sky, reflecting streaks of dusk like brushed metal. I thought about the girl I had been quiet overlooked endlessly, trying to justify her existence. I thought about the woman who now lived here, shaping an entirely different lineage. Emma's final message that night held only 6 words I'm excited for tomorrow's lesson. 6 words that carried no history of expectation, only possibility. For the first time since the investigation began, I believed that the future could be built without dragging the past behind it. I believed I could be part of something that grew from choice, not obligation. And for the first time in my entire life, a member of my family had reached toward me without taking something in return. Windermere felt alive around me, not as a retreat from the world, but as the foundation of the one I was still building, steady earned, and entirely my own. Aunt Eleanor's documents changed everything, but it was what she told me next that revealed the full scope of my family's betrayal. We met again 2 weeks after our initial coffee shop conversation. This time she came to the lake house. I picked her up at the train station in Duluth and drove her through the winding forest roads that led to my property. She gasped when she saw the house, her hand rising to her chest. "Alexia," she breathed, "this is extraordinary." I nodded. It's the first place that ever felt like home. We settled in the library surrounded by books and the smell of cedar wood. I made tea while she looked around, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the careful craftsmanship of every detail. When I returned with the cups, her eyes were shining. "You built this life yourself," she said, "without any of them." I did. She accepted her tea and cradled it between her hands. "I have more to tell you," she said. "Things I didn't want to share until I was sure you were ready to hear them. I'm ready." She took a deep breath. "The pattern with Derek didn't start with the loan guarantee," she said. "It started when you were children. Your parents decided very early that Derek would be their legacy. He was the son, the firstborn, the one who would carry on the family name. You were supposed to be the support system, the backup, the one who helped make his success possible." "I've known that for years," I said. "It's not exactly a revelation." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But what you might not know is how deliberate it was." She set down her tea and pulled another folder from her bag. "I found these in your mother's things years ago. Letters she wrote to your grandmother back when you were small. The letters were yellowed with age, their edges soft from handling. I read them slowly, each one landing like a blow. In one letter, my mother wrote about how easy Derek was compared to me. "He's so confident," she wrote. "Alexia is always questioning, always demanding explanations. I don't know where she gets it from. She exhausts me." In another letter, she discussed their financial plans for the children. "We're putting aside money for Derek's education," she wrote. "Alexia is smart, she'll probably get scholarships. And if not, she can work her way through like I did. Derek needs more support, he's more sensitive." The letters continued through my childhood and adolescence, documenting a systematic preference that I had always felt but never seen in writing. "Derek gets my attention because he needs it more. Alexia is so independent it's almost cold. I worry she doesn't really love us like a normal daughter should." A normal daughter. As if I had been some kind of deviation from the expected pattern. As if my independence was a character flaw rather than a survival mechanism. The worst letter came from just after my high school graduation. I read it 3 times before I could fully absorb its meaning. "We didn't go to Alexia's ceremony," my mother wrote. "Derek had a job interview that day and we needed to support him. Alexia didn't seem to mind. She never seems to mind anything. Sometimes I wonder if there's something wrong with her emotionally. She doesn't need us the way a child should need her parents." I set the letter down. My hands were trembling. "I remember that graduation," I said. I remember looking for them in the audience and not seeing them. I told myself it didn't matter. I graduated valedictorian. I had already been accepted to college on a full scholarship. I told myself I didn't need them to be proud of me. Eleanor reached across and took my hand. "You were right," she said. "You didn't need them, but you deserved them anyway. Every child deserves parents who show up." The final document in her folder was the most recent an email exchange from just before the loan guarantee was forged. Eleanor had obtained it from a mutual acquaintance, someone who had been inadvertently copied on the thread. The emails discussed me in clinical terms. They analyzed my financial situation, my assets, and my creditworthiness. They debated the best way to use my information without my knowledge, and they included a chilling assessment from my mother. "Alexia won't fight back," she wrote. "She never has. She's spent her whole life trying to earn our approval. If we frame this right, she'll sign whatever we put in front of her. And if she discovers it later, she's too proud to make a scene. She'll quietly accept responsibility rather than air family business in public." They had counted on my loyalty. They had weaponized my desire for connection. They had assumed that my love for them would override my self-interest. They had been wrong. I gathered the documents into a careful pile. Everything Eleanor had given me joined the Redemption Archive, a record of exploitation that now stretched back decades. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was clear. My family had viewed me as a resource from the moment I was born, cultivating just enough connection to keep me available when they needed something. "What do you want to do with this?" Eleanor asked. I looked at her for a long moment. "I want them to know that I know I said. I want them to understand that I have documentation of everything they've done, and I want to see their faces when they realize they can't manipulate me anymore." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Be careful," she said. "People who have been cornered can become dangerous." "I know," I said, "but I've been careful my whole life. It's time for them to be careful of me." Richard Townsend, my father's attorney, sent the request on a Tuesday morning. His message held a rehearsed calm, the kind that tries to disguise urgency but never succeeds. He proposed a meeting, a neutral location. Just the family, he wrote, as though the phrase still meant something to any of us. I agreed, yet only under conditions that ensured I would not be cornered or drowned out. The community center in a small town between Minneapolis and Rochester was quiet, plain, and impossible to manipulate. I told them I would bring my attorney, Marcus. They were welcome to bring anyone they needed, and I informed Richard in writing that the conversation would be recorded. No one objected. A cold front swept across the Midwest the morning of the meeting. Wind carved through the empty parking lot as I stepped out of my car. My coat wasn't heavy enough for the temperature, but I welcomed the sting. It sharpened every thought. I walked into the building, chose a seat at the far side of the table, and waited. They arrived together. Derek entered first, his skin sallow and tense. Sabrina followed him, her expression carefully arranged into something meant to appear neutral, but failing to hide the strain. My father and mother came last. He carried himself with stiff caution. She clung to his arm in a way that hinted she feared the ground beneath her might shift. No one spoke as they settled. The room seemed to absorb the weight of everything we had never said to each other, years of favoritism, denial, and quiet wounds layered so tightly that any movement felt dangerous. My father cleared his throat. "Alexia," he began, his voice uncertain. "We're still a family. Whatever's happened, we should work through it together." His appeal might have softened me once. Not today. I reached for the folder I had prepared. A single motion of my hand drew every eye to the table. I laid out the evidence documents revealing the unauthorized loan guarantee notes from analysts, verifying the forgery communications that traced how my financial information had been gathered and repurposed without my knowledge. Their expressions shifted as the reality of what lay before them became impossible to deny. Derek's jaw slackened. Tension drained from Sabrina's posture as if her spine had stumbled. My mother's eyes fluttered toward the floor. My father kept still, but the muscle in his cheek twitched. "You used my name," I said, letting my voice remain steady. "You used it to open doors that were never meant for you. You used it knowing I hadn't agreed, knowing I hadn't even been told." Derek lifted his head. "It isn't what you think. His attempt at an explanation disintegrated under my stare. "It's exactly what it appears to be," I replied. "You created documents that suggested I stood behind your business. You forged my approval. You intercepted letters intended for me, and while all that was happening, you told me I wasn't good enough to show my face at your events." My mother made a small sound, something between regret and desperation. I met her gaze briefly. "You wrote to grandmother once," I said quietly. "You described me as cold. You said I didn't love you the way a daughter should. You had no idea what I was carrying." Her fingers tightened in her lap. I wondered why I was never enough. I continued. "Now I know. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted an asset, someone reliable, someone quiet." My father's veneer cracked. "We were in trouble," he said, leaning forward as if proximity could soften the truth. "Your brother's company needed support. We thought things would turn around before you ever had to know. We made mistakes, Alexia, but we're facing ruin now. Everything we saved, everything we built, it's slipping away. Please, consider helping us." A long pause unfolded. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the ribs. "No," I said. The refusal landed simply without theatrics. I kept my voice even. "You're asking me to carry responsibility for choices I didn't make. You want me to rescue a business that never should have existed in its current form. You want access to resources you never contributed to. And you want me to forget the way you cut me out the moment it suited you." Derek bristled. "You always thought you were above us." "That was never true," I answered. "All I wanted was to stand on the same ground. You couldn't tolerate that." I gathered the documents into the folder, aligning the edges with deliberate care. The gesture steadied me more than any breath could. "My boundaries are not up for negotiation," I said. "I won't sign anything for you. I won't invest in Derek's company. And the lake house is off limits. It's not an extension of the Marlowe estate. It's not a bargaining chip. It's the only place in my life that exists without your fingerprints on it." Sabrina's composure faltered. "Alexia, be reasonable." "This meeting is concluded," I said, rising. Marcus stood as well, his presence calm but unmistakably firm. "All further communication will go through my office," he added. I walked toward the exit. Something compelled me to stop at the doorway. One last truth waited behind my teeth. "You once asked why I never seemed to need anyone," I said, turning only enough to see their silhouettes. "You decided very early that affection was conditional. I learned to survive without it because that was the only way to remain intact." None of them spoke. No one moved. "I spent years loving you," I said softly, deeply, quietly, constantly. "You taught me that love was something earned through usefulness. I don't live by those rules anymore." The room held its breath as I stepped out. Cold air swept across my face the moment I reached the parking lot. Wind cut through the branches above me, carrying the first hints of winter, sharp, honest, unadorned. The season had changed, and so had I. News of the collapse reached me before my family managed to call. Articles appeared across several business feeds early that morning, each one describing the downfall of Marlowe Construction Partners in language colder than anything I could have written myself. The bank had completed its inquiry. Their findings left no room for negotiation. Within hours of the report, the company accounts were locked, equipment, repossessed, contracts suspended. The foundation Derek had insisted was unbreakable, folded under the weight of its own dishonesty. His name surfaced repeatedly in those articles, never as a visionary, never as an entrepreneur, only as a man under investigation for forging a financial guarantee he had no authority to use. Reporters noted the family connection with clinical detachment as though I were merely a footnote in someone else's cautionary tale. I read every line without feeling the victory that strangers might have expected. Something else took its place, a quiet absence where anger used to live. The legal process advanced quickly once the bank formalized its complaint. Prosecutors prepared charges for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. My parents appeared in the preliminary documentation as individuals who facilitated access to confidential information, though investigators focused first on Derek, who had orchestrated the scheme. Watching the case gather momentum felt like observing a distant storm, loud, consuming, but no longer capable of reaching me. Sabrina reacted faster than anyone. Her divorce filing arrived in early December, wrapped in accusations about Derek's judgment and labeled with the urgency of someone desperate to detach herself before the damage spread. She demanded custody assets and whatever remnants she could salvage. Derek's name, once a badge my parents polished, had become something she treated like a stain. My mother called days later. Her voice sounded unfamiliar, as though it had traveled through too many nights without sleep. She tried to explain decades of choices by framing them as burdens she had carried alone. Derek's fragility, his endless needs, the pressure of molding 2 children into lives that made sense to her. She insisted none of it had been meant to harm me. She simply did her best. I listened until the justifications circled back to the same place they always lived. "I'm not angry anymore," I told her. "I'm just done sacrificing myself." Her breath caught. I ended the call before guilt could find a foothold it hadn't earned. My father communicated differently. A letter arrived at my Minneapolis apartment, the envelope thin but heavy with confession. He wrote about the scarcity that shaped his childhood, how every risk felt like a threat, how every setback echoed that earlier poverty. Fear, he insisted, had driven him to protect Derek at all costs. Supporting a son he believed too fragile for the world seemed like an urgent, unquestionable duty. I read his words while the evening light thinned across my living room floor and realized he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking to be understood. Nothing in his explanation softened what had been done. It only clarified the lineage of fear he had chosen to pass down. His apology occupied the final paragraph spare and resigned. "We failed you. I don't know how to repair it. I'm sorry for the choices, not the consequences." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the redemption archive. Some truths belonged there more than anywhere else. January brought another shift. The house my parents had lived in for nearly 4 decades went up for sale. Their remaining savings couldn't support the mortgage once Derek's business income evaporated. The neighborhood looked exactly as it had when I was 10 quiet streets and trimmed hedges, but the home they'd treated as a monument to Derek's future now sat hollow. I drove past only once. Frost coated the yard and the windows reflected nothing. I didn't slow the car. By the time spring arrived, prosecutors had finished their review. Derek faced a string of charges that would follow him for years, perhaps longer. My parents retreated into a modest apartment funded by Social Security and whatever limited resources creditors hadn't already claimed. Even their beloved gala, the yearly exhibition of curated pride, disappeared from the calendar without announcement. The absence felt like a curtain falling on a performance no one believed in anymore. Silence stretched between us through those months. I didn't expect contact, which is why my father's final email caught me off guard. It appeared late on a Sunday night, a single sentence surrounded by empty space. "I hope someday you can forgive us for what we are not, for what we did." He still couldn't articulate accountability. Still asked me to accept their nature as if nature excused choice. Still reached for absolution without offering any true repair. I kept the email for the archive, then closed my laptop. Some endings require no ceremony. Some doors shut themselves once the truth has circulated long enough through the air. This one settled quietly without resistance, and I didn't open it again. Spring arrived quietly at Windermere, not in a burst of color, but in a slow thaw that loosened the lake's grip on winter. Sheets of ice cracked apart across the water, drifting until sunlight dissolved them completely. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It happened in subtle shifts, melting edges, softer winds, longer mornings. That kind of change felt familiar. My life had begun to shift the same way, almost imperceptibly at first, then all at once clear. Work on Clarity Path had expanded into something larger than I'd envisioned. Applications poured in, women from every background, each carrying their own history of being overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. Their stories echoed pieces of mine, and guiding them forward became an anchor I hadn't realized I needed. Building a future for someone who reminded me of my younger self felt like stitching together something that had torn long ago. A name among the applicants stopped me. Emma Marlowe. Her essay was short, but decisive. "I want to learn something no one in my family understands. I want to make my own path." Not once did she mention the turmoil surrounding her father. She didn't apologize for his choices. She didn't ask me to reconcile anything. She just reached toward the one adult who had never asked her to shrink. Her acceptance was the first one I signed. Our weekly calls became a surprising solace. She absorbed information quickly, writing small programs and sending them to me with shy pride. She reminded me that the next generation could break cycles without replicating the harm that shaped them. Summer settled over the lake house in golden layers. I split my days between mentoring advising companies and strengthening the backbone of Clarity Path. Evenings belonged to silence, the kind that wasn't empty but restorative. No messages from my parents, no demands, no attempts to pull me back into a version of myself that no longer existed. Then September arrived with an unexpected email my mother wanted to meet. I chose a small cafe outside Rochester, a place neither of us had ties to. She arrived early, seated at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. Her hair had thinned, and the self-assurance she once wore like armor seemed to have fallen away. We talked without pretense. She admitted to the choices she'd made, the favoritism she'd excused, the silence she'd allowed. No justifications, no dramatic requests for reconciliation. She only asked to speak the truth aloud, maybe for the first time in her life. "I don't expect anything from you," she said quietly, "but I want you to know I recognize the woman you became, and I'm sorry that I didn't know how to raise her." The apology slid between us, not sharp, not manipulative, not rehearsed, just human. I accepted the words, but not the weight of repairing what decades had broken. Some relationships don't rebuild, they simply stop collapsing. We hugged in the parking lot before parting. The embrace felt like closing a chapter, not opening a new one. Driving back to the lake house, I realized something unexpected. Peace doesn't always come as triumph. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet understanding that the past can't be rewritten, only released. Windermere welcomed me home with a stillness that reached all the way inside. The water lay smooth under the fading light. I walked out to the end of the dock and sat with my feet dangling above the surface, letting the twilight breathe around me. Derek's sentencing no longer occupied any space in my mind. The apartment my parents had downsized into felt like a distant fact detached from my life. Everything that once dictated my worth drifted out of reach, reduced to noise that no longer touched me. What mattered now was the life I had shaped from nothing but my own will, steady, deliberate, unborrowed. No forged signatures, no whispered comparisons, no shrinking to fit inside someone else's narrative. The lake reflected the last streaks of gold in the sky. They faded, but the water held them a moment longer, as if refusing to let them go too quickly. My story used to orbit people who couldn't see me. Now it belonged entirely to the woman who stepped away. I didn't rebuild myself to be admired. I rebuilt myself so their absence could never break me again.